Hi, I'm Bob Whiten. I'm the product manager for Hilco, and I'll be your instructor for this series. For standard temple tip replacement, we're going to need to use a frame warmer, and I'm going to use a hot air model here. And this model works by simply just on-off switch, and it has a couple of different heat control settings for high temperature and low temperature. We'll set it on the low for the temple tip replacement. We're not going to need a lot of heat. We're also going to need some temple tip replacements. And in the industry today, basically about 1.4 to around 1.6 millimeters is the standard core size, and they fall in between those two numbers as well. So there's a 1.4 core wire size, a 1.6, but for frames that are becoming more popular in the materials of stainless steel and titanium, their core wires are dropping down to about 1.1, so there's really a specialty tip for those types of frames. Here's the frame that we're going to replace the tip on. You can see the temple tip is broken and frayed, so it's going to need replacement because that will cause some irritation behind the patient's ear. So to remove it, we simply place it in the frame warmer. We'll turn the heat on in the blower. Heat it up for about 5 or 10 seconds. And then we can straighten out the tip. And then remove it. Slide it off. Now, you can use the trial and error method for replacing temple tips. There's really just two sizes that you're going to go to. Or you can use the fast fine screw gauge to measure the size of your core wire as well. Doesn't fit through the 1.4. It won't fit through the 1.5. It's going to be the 1.6 version. So quickly we've identified that we need the 1.6 millimeter tip. And what I usually do is just get it started on the frame, on the core, and I give it some heat because I want the plastic to become pliable. If I try shoving it on without at least heating it slightly, there's a chance that the tip may split. So by giving it some heat, we've made it pliable, and we can push it on the remainder of the way, and then we can make our skull bend. Check our 4-point alignment. And there we have the temple tip replaced. Now, many frames that come with cable temples don't have any covering over the cables for your patient. So you may want to provide some covering or some protection on the cables because there may be an irritation that could occur behind the ear on your patient, or maybe they're even having an allergic reaction to the metal being up against their skin. Here's a typical example of some cables, and there is an acetate cover that can be adapted to these cables, and they come in a few different diameters, but they're somewhat a little bit difficult to work with, and you have to inventory a few different size diameters. And they are inserted cold without any heat, because if you use heat on these cables, they become pliable very fast, and there's a chance that the end of the cable could poke through the covering. But they slide on cold, and now we have a plastic covering around the cable. But once again, you'll have to stock a few different diameters of this cable to service all the cables in the market. An easier solution is using shrink tubing. Here we have a long piece of shrink tubing. Usually a piece is cut so that you can service two temples. And how this works is much more quick and efficient. You just simply slide the shrink tubing over the cable. Okay. We have found the end of the cable with our finger. And then we'll take a knife and just slice away that cable, remove the excess. Now, by using the hot air frame warmer, we place it in the frame warmer, heat up the cable, and it usually takes about 15 to 20 seconds. The shrink tubing starts to contract around the cable for a perfect fit. So there's really only need to stock one size of the shrink tubing instead of many different sizes of the acetate cover. As you can see, the shrink tubing has completely shrunk around the cable for protection. It has almost like a silicone-like texture as well. It's much more comfortable than the acetate covers. At the end of the cable, it's possible you might have just a little tip that you need to slice off. If you left a little excess. And there you have a great cover done quickly and easily. Many manufacturers today are offering less temple sizes or temple lengths to you to service your customers, which can create problems. Possibly you can only buy a certain temple length in a 135 or a 140 millimeter, and you're fitting your patient and it turns out that they need a 145 or a 150 millimeter temple. But there's a real quick and simple solution to this problem simply by changing the temple tip. And they're called temple tip extenders. Here I've laid 3 of them out. Basically what they are extra long temple covers, and you can gain 5, 10, and 15 millimeters respectively simply by changing the tip. And the way to go about doing this is to put the old tip in the frame warmer, heat it up for removal, heat it for about 10 seconds. Okay, then I can straighten that out. Now I'm going to take a reading off of this temple, measuring front to back, and I'm getting 140. So when I was fitting the patient, for instance, we'll say that we needed a 150 millimeter temple, so I have to add 10 millimeters to this temple. So I remove the old temple, and I'll grab the temple tip, extender tip. Almost goes on all the way, but I need a little heat to force it all the way up to the top. You always want to use heat so that you don't split the tip. Okay. Now I have my tip on, and we'll take the measurement one more time, make sure we've gained what we need, and it's a 150 millimeter temple length. And we can make our skull bend. And now by simply changing the temple tip, we've added 10 millimeters, and now we can fit the patient properly. Now perhaps you're fitting your patient with a skull temple, and the temple is too long. As you're making the skull bend, you're getting too much of an overlay behind the ear, and you want to shorten it some. The tools that you'll need to do that is a good cutter, a PD ruler, and a marker. Now on this particular frame, we're going to shorten this temple by 5 millimeters. So what we'll do is we'll remove the old tip by placing it in a frame warmer. Applying heat so that it doesn't break the tip as we remove it, because we're going to want to put that back on when the job is complete. Okay, now we've exposed the core wire, and we're going to want to shorten that by 5 millimeters. So we take our PD ruler and our marker, and we measure from the tip up towards the front of the frame 5 millimeters. We're going to cut that portion of the core wire away so that we can shorten the temple 5 millimeters. And I'll use the Ergo Pro cutter. It should cut through this nicely. Okay. Now we have our old tip. Now we've shortened the core wire. Now when we put the tip back on and get it started, I want to heat that up. When you put the tip back on, we have shortened the temple by 5 millimeters. We have a temple length on the original side of 140 as it reads on the temple. Take our measurement, and we are at 135. And you can shorten it 5, 10, 15 millimeters, whatever the patient needs. And then we can make our skull bend. Take our alignment. Then you can go ahead and shorten the other side, and the job is complete. Perhaps your customer has picked a frame off the frame board and it has skull temples on it, and they would like to have cables put on, but the manufacturer doesn't offer cable temples in that particular style. You can easily add cables to any frame, whether it's metal or plastic. Here we're going to do a metal temple cable conversion, and this is the equipment that we're going to need. Here are the actual cables that we're going to attach to the frame. We're going to need a good cutter, a file, a marking tool, and a PD rule. Now the first step in performing the cable conversion is to fit your patient with the regular skull temple first, so you know where the bend has to be. So fit them with the skull temple is the first step. Now that that's complete, you remove the temple from the frame. Just back out the screw. Okay, makes it much easier to work with. Lay the temple down onto the bench. And now take the cable that you're going to convert over to and lay it over the temple bend for bend, matching the bend for bend here. That's where you want the bend to be for your patient. Now if you're a little unsure about the fitting, you'll want to make the cable maybe just a little bit longer, because it's a lot easier to shorten it, and in order to lengthen it, it would require soldering. So if you're a little unsure, the first time you're trying this customizing job, I would make it a little bit longer, but normally it's bend for bend, and that's a perfect match for your patient. Now, with it matching bend for bend, we make a mark at the very front of the cable. That's where we want it to start on the temple. So there's our black mark number 1. Now 8 millimeters back from that mark, make mark number 2. And the reason for the second mark is that's where our cutting point is going to be. This cable is actually a piece of nylon, molded nylon, that has a hole that's 8 millimeters deep. So we're going to expose 8 millimeters of the core wire and insert it into this cable. So now we have to expose the core wire, and that's where the cutters come into play. This is where a good pair of heavy-duty cutters really comes in handy. At our second mark, the one furthest back on the temple, just cut completely through the temple. Okay, this piece is no good. You can put that aside. And now all we do is remove the rest of the acetate cover. And this 8 millimeters is going to insert into the cable. But before we do that, it's a good idea just to file the end down to a point. It really aids in the insertion into the cable. Any burrs that are left on there from cutting may hinder you from getting the cable on easily. So just file it down to a point, a few strokes. Okay. And then take the cable, just get it started. Just want to get it on the end there so it's not going to fall off. And then we're going to use a frame warmer to heat that nylon and make it pliable. Now when that heats, the nylon does become pliable, which allows us to push the cable in the full length of the 8 millimeters. When that cools, the nylon will contract around the core wire, and that's what holds the cable in place. Good. Now you have the option of dipping the cable in water to cool it quickly. You can just let it air cool. It takes about 1 minute to cool down. Then you can put it back onto the frame and then dispense it to your patient. And there you have it. There was the original skull temple, and we converted it over to a cable cover. As we did with the metal temples, plastic temples can also be converted over to cables. There's just a couple of added steps, not very time consuming, in which you need to accomplish before you can do the